Grazie per la presentazione. Now, of course, I'll switch to English. So for all of you, I think it will be the case. Also, I prepared my slides in English, so we can start. I think today I'm going to speak about, as you may see, about the presence of Schiller in Cassius' philosophy of science. And you will see why I have taken the realm of shadows, which is, as you may know, the first title of Das Ideal und das Leben. It's a reference that Cassius makes to Schiller in his book on relativity theory. So let's see whether this works. No, it's just, I know, because I know this. So that's an outline of my talk. Basically, I will start from some preliminary assumptions because we have, to cope with methodology. What I will do is basically to reconstruct chronologically Cassius' references to Schiller, especially in epistemological writings. Of course, I will do reference to Idee und Gestalt or Freiheit und Form, but mainly I will focus on epistemological writing. I think this could be very interesting for our purpose and can, in some sense, integrate with other talks that I have heard in these days. And so we will have some concluding remarks. So as to the preliminary assumptions, I will state clearly that there's something that I do not want to say, which is that Schiller is the decisive influence, the crucial influence to understand Cassius' philosophy of science. When we start saying something, we think to have brilliant ideas that would, I don't know, rework every interpretation about a certain field. Of course, I do not want to do that. Also because it's not true. Schiller is not the crucial influence to understand Cassius' philosophy of science, but it could be worth giving a look at this influence, because in some important points Schiller surface in Cassius' works. Of course, there are several other sources which are crucial to Cassius' philosophy of science, such as Hertz, Duhem. We will come back to Duhem, specifically Poincaré, also Felix Klein. What I want conversely to say, Schiller's view, as some of you has already underlined, is crucial to understand the shift concerning Kant's original philosophy, and so the interpretation of these neo-Kantians about Kantian philosophy, and thus, in some sense, neo-Kantianism in principle. So if these philosophers are called neo-Kantians, the means that allow them to shift from Kantianism to neo-Kantianism is, in some sense, the core point of the whole situation. I think that two main issues are important to understand Schiller's influence on Cassius' philosophy of science. First, the confutation of the copy theory of knowledge, because, of course, as many of the neo-Kantians are convinced that in Kant there's a remnant of empiricism and externalism. So think about the passage in Critique of Pure Reason about existence and the being as Setzung. And after that, second, the establishment of an aesthetic idealism. And see, I think that you can make reference to Cassius' concept of Wille zur Gestaltung, so will to formation, in his posthumous writings, which also impacts on the philosophy of science. So after the turn to the philosophy of culture, philosophy of science and philosophy of culture, are interwoven. And this idea of Wille zur Gestaltung and of an aesthetic idealism, which resonates, which is combined with the philosophy of science, I think is pivotal. So let's start with this timeline of reference, which is basically what I will do today. Surprisingly, the first reference to Schiller can be dated back very early in Cassius' production, and specifically two works from 1907. The first reference is made in the second volume of the Erkenntnisproblem. And so you see here a quotation of Xenion, so an epigram from Goethe's Schiller&neoKantianism about the interpretation of critical philosophy. So one of the first points, the first point that I have mentioned before. So basically, critical philosophy doesn't know anything about the thing, so doesn't know anything about reality as a substance in some sense, counterposed to the knowing subject, and it does not know anything about the soul. So and of course, this is a clear statement against the copy theory of knowledge. So the idea that knowledge is about the mirroring of external reality in concepts, and you can, for those of you who know Cassirer, but I know there are Cassirer in there, think about the first part of substance and function. So the criticism raised against Aristotle's theory of abstraction. And Cassirer in that passage says that the copy theory of knowledge must be replaced by a focus on normativity and the logical structure of experience. So classic neo-Kantianism, basically. And so it's very interesting that Schiller is mentioned here in this very programmatic statement about what a neo-Kantian in the philosophy of science is supposed to do. Second, and I think more surprisingly, Schiller is mentioned in Cantum die moderne Mathematik, which was a very long essay that Cassirer devoted to especially the comparison and the possibility of shaping a transcendental philosophy of mathematics against the rising logicism. And what you see here is the mention of Schiller's point that critical philosophy has to be distinguished from natural science. So basically, wenn Sie sich im Zugen trennen, so we have to distinguish the natural scientist and the transcendental philosopher. So I think that there is another important passage in which Schiller surfaces at the beginning of Cassirer's, so to speak, career. At the very beginning, because we have Leibniz system and so on and so forth. But basically, this statement is made about the fact that we have to save some kind of primacy for philosophy in understanding scientific enterprise, which is very important because, as we have said yesterday, starting from Poynting, we know that in order to have philosophy, we must analyze science, which in some sense develops historically independently of philosophy. So philosophy just has to work after that science has evolved in a certain sense. And so it's important that I have here a claim about the primacy of philosophy. Then we can jump, because as far as I see, there were no references to Schiller in Substance and Function, but of course we have some references, or not some references, we have an entire chapter devoted to Schiller in Freiheit und Form. And again, we have here the hint at the circumstance that Schiller was fundamental to understand the neo-Kantian interpretation of, or at least Cassirer's neo-Kantian interpretation of Kantian philosophy. And it's on a very important point. So the very relation between theory and experience. So Cassirer says that basically, and also perhaps distinguishing in sense from other neo-Kantians, both from the Baden and Marburg, so Lange and others, Cassirer explicitly mentioned, of course, he thinks that Schiller's work has to be analyzed as a whole work, so where the poet and the thinker are in some sense united, but in that place he says, I am thinking of Schiller as a poet, as a thinker, so the other way around. And he says the most important discovery of Schiller is that experience has to be related to principles, and so experience must be in some sense brought back to theory, and of course it is also valid the opposite statement, so to speak. So the question is that I have experience which has to be traced back to theory and principles, and of course I have theory and principles that has to be brought to experience. I think that this can be embedded very clearly without, a strong effort in the very landscape of the epistemology of the first decades of the 20th century, and especially in the concept of coordination. Of course, if you read Reitman's book about the reign of relativity, you find that work with, whose influence can be traced back to Petzold, as also here as shown in one of his papers. And so we have the concept of Zwarden, which can be translated as coordination. So basically what we do in epistemology is to study this coordination between theoretical principles and experience. So we have to think about that there are something as theoretical principles, and then there's experience. And it's here the epistemological problem basically rises, because in this kind of interpretation of Schiller's and reshaping of neo-Kantianism, of course, we do not have an idealistic philosophy in some sense. We do not only have the spontaneous creation of experience and external reality, so to speak, but we also have some autonomy on the objective side. And in fact, one of Schiller's concepts that Cassirer quotes the most, it's also the autonomy of the organic, which is something that comes from Goethe, and that, of course, relates to the fact that we have, of course, humans as poets shape reality. So it means that I do not have an external reality to which I can come independently of my thinking functions, and so to independent of the spontaneity of the understanding and reason. But also when this happens, I have an autonomy in the object. When I do a work of art, I have both sides that I have to combine. And that's also why I agree with those that see a hint of dialectic thinking here. But in any case, we have this autonomy of the object. So we have the autonomy of the subject, the autonomy of the object. Then we have coordination, combination, one between these two fields. So Schiller serves the purpose of clearly setting these two sections. And of course, here you can think also about Schiller's concept of beauty as liberty in the appearance, which you can find by way of example in Kallias Briefe. Again, in Freiheit und Form, there's a long quotation from philosophical letters. That's also Cassirer's use. When he refers to Schiller, basically, he didn't give the quote, so he didn't declare that he's quoting, but really there are long pieces of Cassirer's papers on, and Cassirer's works on Schiller, which are really, really just quotation. Very interesting, we are told here, again, that we have something against the copy theory of knowledge. So our more pure concepts are in no way images of things, but they are just signs, so certain and coexisting signs. So the idea is again the same. We have the concept of Zuordnung, which is put in foreground. So theoretical relationships between theoretical concepts, and these task of creating an agreement between this theoretical relationship and the kind of relationship that you find in experience. And there's just, of course, you can find a lot of quotes that can resembles the passage which are paraphrased from Schiller's philosophical letters. I've just selected one. So the idea that our complete knowledge does never offer us the object themselves, but only signs of them. And of course, of their reciprocal relations, which is basically a concept really taken, that can be squared with this passage from Schiller. And it continues also from the previous quotation about this idea of the Kraft der Seele, so the power of the soul. And again, also, if you see the passage, which I not put into a board, but the idea is that you have here the fact that you can ensure a good agreement between, so to speak, science and things, so theory and experience, if you can ensure that there's no contradiction in that process. So again, another thing that I would like to underline is that Cassirer that right in saying that he is very close to neo-empiricism in some way. So this idea of Zuordnung is really something that circulates in German epistemology, German Austrian epistemology of that time. And in fact, I referred here to a famous letter that Cassirer sent to Schlick on the 23rd October 1920 about, you know, all the story about the relativized a priori. Sorry, I have sometimes to, I'm a bit in a hurry right now, so I cannot focus on that. But I will just make you aware about the fact that in that passage, Cassirer saves in some sense transcendental philosophy, and so its primacy concerning its critical primacy, we can say, with respect to science, in the sense that this principle of agreement, even though we have to comply with experience, so we have to trust experience to understand whether a specific coordination is valid or not. Well, the fact that there is this very coordination is not empirical. It must be assumed in some sense in principle. And so it's this what Cassirer calls as an expression of reason. I think ein Ausdruck der Vernunft des Logos selbst. And so the idea is that I think this concept of unity of nature, which also in contemporary epistemology has been again, in some sense, to which has been again drawn attention, can be compared to Schiller's Kraft der Seele. So Schiller's Kraft der Seele becomes this unity of nature as the synthetic power of the transcendental subject, which understands reality through the means of theoretical science, and of course, especially mathematical physics. This will bring to a very peculiar reelaboration and revision of the analytic synthetic distinction, but it's really a big topic, so sorry for that. I think to skip that, but in case if you will have questions, I can answer during the Q&A. But I think that it's very interesting that at this point, after having considered all these important passages in which Schiller surfaces, we can also say that the revision of the distinction and the main idea that knowledge is about the coordination of theoretical principles with experience can also be connected to theoretical knowledge, to a very method of discourse in contemporary epistemology. That's the first appendix in case you will give a look at Cassirer's response to Schlick, so the letter to which I was referring before. But just see here that he had an expression of reason of logos as such, so this principle of the unity of nature. Then we come to the passage which is given the title to my talk, which is taken from Cassirer's book on Einstein, so to Einstein's Relativitätstheorie. And here you find really a passage in which Schiller is quoted very clearly, and the reference is to das Reich der Schatten, so the realm of shadows. Why? Because Cassirer thinks that Schiller's reference to ideas as shadows is the most appropriate definition of what an idea is in its shaping power of external data and of experience. Basically, what happens is that Cassirer say, okay, what happens with relativity does not scare us as neo-Kantian philosophers, because we know that there's nothing terrible in saying that space and time are not thinking in themselves. Surprise, surprise, we did know that. What happens is that for the realm of ideas is for realm a realm of shadows, and so you see the reference to Schiller. And so the point is our consciousness, which is a form of neo-Kantianism, which allows us to not to be surprised by this revolution in relativity theory, can be understood in the way of Schiller. And so in that sense, no pure idea corresponds directly to a concrete real object, but rather the ideas can always only be pointed out in their systematic community as fundamental moments of concrete objective knowledge. That's basically theoretical holism. Okay, so the kind of holism that you find in the epistemology of science, starting from UM, and UM is one, of course, of Cassir's main sources. And what I think we must do is follow in Schiller to understand in which sense Cassir's holism is created and how it can be distinguished from other forms of holism. This also has been already made, I have to say, in literature. Okay, we can just come to Alan Richardson, who recently in an essay devoted to Cassir's philosophy of science was concerned with holism. Basically, what Schiller makes for Cassir easier in some sense is to think of a kind of holism which basically does not need of empirical statements as vectors of verification of a certain scientific statement. So what happens is that in this interesting essay, Richardson say, okay, if I compare Cassir's kind of a holism with contemporary kinds of holism, by way of example, those of Quine, which are devoted to an empirical shaping of holism. So in Quine, you have recalcitrant experiences that at the boundary can make you aware about the fact that it's not impossible, that it's impossible, sorry, to understand, to falsify or to verify, better say, a proposition, a theoretical proposition from within. So the idea of Quine is to say that science is an open endeavor, and so you cannot take anything for granted, and so on and so forth. In Cassir, the point is to make everything intra-theoretical, which is, of course, very neo-Kantian from my point of view. And in fact, Richardson say at the end of his essay that the goal of mathematical science is to subsume and explain all such facts under this and within this intra-theoretical construction. And when this happens, Richardson has, we have the entirety of experience as a determinate object of knowledge. So Richardson's conclusion about Quine is that Quine's holism is not holistic enough, and Cassir can, in some sense, provides an alternative to that. So the point is that all we are saying in your Kantian philosophers, starting from the idealistic tradition and the post-Kantian tradition, it goes through Schiller and his reinterpretation of Kant, and we arrive to contemporary questions, so to speak, in the philosophy of science, which establish this task of setting a revised program in understanding holism, so the under determination of theory. And you may also think about some possible references by thinking of Hansen, Kuhn, Fayad, and so on and so forth. Of course, this is Das Reich der Schatten. Cassir also, I have to say, refers to the fact that the first version of Das Ideal und das Leben is the best, just because shadows are, according to Cassir, a very good name for ideas. Okay, perhaps it's too complicated, this appendix. We can skip that and just come to the because I think there's a part on Schiller that it is worthwhile giving a look at. In any case, we can give a look at it during the debate. But I would like to show you that in some sense you find this idea, this characterization of ideas as shadows, and also a reference to holism in the works which are explicitly devoted to Schiller. So Schiller's Philosophische Welt an sich, which is the 12th volume of Cassirs nachgelassene Manuskripte und Texte. It's an Abendvorlesung that Cassir held during the winter semester at the University of Hamburg of 1920-1921, and it is not by chance that it was also the semester in which he delivered the course on Einstein's relativity. So it's very interesting that the work on Schiller in that time, the work on relativity were interwoven. And he says that the realm of shadows is the realm of form, and this is the authentic realm of life, but of a certain kind of life which is not matter. So pure matter as something that stands in front of the subject is the matter which is transformed into game, so Spiel, and image. So again, the interweaving of philosophy of science and aesthetic idealism, which is very interesting. In fact, every objective formation, as I have said, depends on our will to formation, and then also every kind of object is an image of the spirit, but in the sense that it is also autonomous as an object. So it's important to understand this point, and this also happens to science. So also scientific theories, which refers to scientific objects, are images, shadows, or if you prefer, models, as Boltzmann and others has called this kind of models in that time. And so I think that this peculiar combination of aesthetic idealism with the philosophy of science gave rise to the philosophy of symbolic forms. And so you can also explain some criticism, some disputes that you will find in other works of Cassirer, like the one against Eddington in the philosophy of symbolic forms, the third volume, when he criticized Eddington's interpretation of relativity, which is a very peculiar case. I think that there should be more attention on that. But again, in another passage of Idee und Gestalt, so we can just keep these two references from the work explicitly devoted to Schiller, is again another passage rephrased from Philosophical Letters. Rephrase is perhaps a sort of comfortable expression to say that it's basically a quotation without brackets. Cassirer speaks of this Denkkraft. So he changes Schiller's expressions, die Kraft der Seele, with this Denkkraft. So, but basically it's the same. Perhaps he didn't want just to use soul, which he could have found more too much metaphysical in a sense. And he says that das Schöne, so the beauty is no empirical concept, but it is rather an imperative, and so also the scientist as an imperative to construct a beautiful reality through mathematics. That's the idea. And science, as other symbolic forms, are part of the task that we as humans have as artists of a whole world. Of course, there are distinctions between artists and scientists, but again, the point is that we undergo, in some sense, through the reference to Schiller, we have an explanation of how science, after the turn to the philosophy of culture, can be explained as a symbolic form among the others. Without this passage, you cannot explain why models offered by science are not realistic in, in some sense, the naive sense. And so everything is shaped by our intellectual activity, even though everything that we create is autonomous objectively. And so this is, I think, also the difference that Cassirer tries to make with respect to Hegel's objective spirit. So you do not have absolute spirit as sort of terminal point of the whole rays of spirit, and you have a hint of subjectivity. You have a measure of subjectivity in every form. And so you have the relativized system of the philosophy of symbolic forms. These are appendix, but here again, it is interesting that in the passage taken from the philosophy of symbolic forms, in which Cassirer criticized Eddington for his interpretation of relativity theory as the physical theory which observes space-time, which describes space-time from the standpoint of one in particular. And I think it's really a huge case in the philosophy of science, because Eddington defended a subjectivist and, in some sense, idealist interpretation of relativity theory. So it's interesting that Cassirer attacks Eddington. But he says that, again, you cannot say this we cannot know whether we will reach a point in which science will describe reality without the reference to whatever subject. It's a regulative process that we give to science to do that. And in fact, at the end of this quotation, think about that these are the final pages of the whole symbolic forms. Physics gains this unity and extension by advancing toward ever more universal symbols, but in this process, it cannot jump over its own shadow. So again, the word shadow. Physics is a shadow among the others. Okay, I think that we have done. So these are, and is the last references that I have made, that I have found in epistemological writings of that passage. In the course of that time, you find a reference to the Spaziergang. So the promenade, I think, is translated into English. And again, something about so Einstein's relativity theory, but it's basically what I have said. So scientists, like artists, freely generate reality through the models that they have invented. And then you'll find something on determinism and determinism. Sorry, I just come to the concluding remarks. And so what we have found today, the general issue of assessing Cassius and the presence of Schiller in Cassius' philosophy of science is related to the task, the mission of the neo-Kantians, so to speak. So how to interpret Kant? What we have found is that in quotes from 1907, we know that we cannot know things in themselves, they do not exist, and philosophy and natural science are distinct. So it's important to understand for the neo-Kantians that although the philosophical endeavor is based on scientific facts, so on the history of science, basically, philosophy has, for philosophy, we have to preserve some kind of liminarity, I don't know how to say priority. Concerning quotes from 1916, so Freiheit form, knowledge is about going from theory to experience and vice versa. On that sense, Cassius also often quotes Heraclitus, says that the way from the bottom to the top and the other way around are the same way. Also, we have learned that coordination of conceptual with empirical experience or with empirical relations does not imply a copy theory of knowledge. It's the other way around. If you have coordination, you are not copying reality. And you have a sort of relativized a priori, but this is very clearly established in literature. So I just go ahead. In scientific writings like Einstein's theory of relativity and the philosophical problems of relativity, which is the title of the course, you find Schiller's quote from The Realm of Shadows, which has given, as we have seen, the title to my talk, and it clarifies how to interpret coordination. So as a coordination of theoretical concepts, which is symbolic, and that symbolically renders relations in experience. So you find the idea that experience, which Russell has defined it once as the most troubled philosophical concept. So it's interesting that here you find an answer to that. So empirical evidence does not concern sense data, and this allows you to jump into a sort of form of intra-theoretical holism, which can be related, of course, which can be traced back, of course, to UM, which was in some sense a pioneer, and which can be exploited today for for raising objections to the kind of holism which we will find by way of example in Quine. And then in the works devoted to Schiller, so Idee und Gestalt, Schiller's philosophische Welt an sich, you find the final idea that aesthetic idealism and the philosophy of science cannot be parted. They are interwoven because aesthetic idealism is the very core of Cassius' thought. So every cultural object is an image created by the activity of the mind, and you find what I would call today, with more modern terms, a sort of semantic constructivism, which, however, does not avoid providing reality with a sort of autonomy. Another concept that Cassius explicitly based from Schiller. And so you have this replacement of the copy theory of knowledge with symbolic understanding of knowledge, and as far as epistemology is concerned, and theory-related epistemology. In this respect, Sears also often quote Goethe and the idea that alles das Faktische schon Theorie ist, so every fact is already a theory. And we weren't concerned with that, so thanks for attention.
Ringrazio Luigi per questa splendida relazione, per me è stata veramente densa e ricca di spunti. Infatti mi permetto di dire giusto una cosa rapidamente e poi lascio la parola al pubblico. Tu hai ben evidenziato dei temi che ovviamente sono a me molto cari. Io qui ho preso una serie di appunti, vabbè, ovviamente la bellezza e la libertà nell'apparenza, l'unità della natura come espressione del logos, e questo ovviamente è un concetto, penso che tu sarai d'accordo, platonico e della tradizione platonica. Quindi mi interessava sapere, secondo te, quali sono i punti di contatto e quali sono invece i punti di divisione rispetto a questa tradizione. E poi hai parlato anche della combinazione tra idealismo tedesco e filosofia della scienza, e hai richiamato all'ulismo, che è un altro dei concetti che noi troviamo se pensiamo alla differenza tra ovviamente il pas pasapan, quindi il tutto come somma delle parti, e invece l'olon, che è l'intero. Stavo pensando, ne parlavamo prima di Proclo, quindi la tradizione sempre neoplatonica, pensavo ovviamente che lì l'intero si traduce nella corrispondenza dell'idea a tutto l'intelletto, all'intero intelletto. Quindi ti chiedevo anche rispetto a questo come viene declinato. Grazie. Scusami per te queste domande.
No, forse dovrei ripeterle perché già non me ne ricordo più. But perhaps I can translate the question. I was asked about basically the possible correlations between Kazir's understanding of this point with Anselm philosophy, and especially with the idea of unity of nature, which Marius told me that is basically taken from Plato, and so the kind of distinctions and I don't know, perhaps overlappings that can be raised. And the other one was about okay, and so okay, and the relationship between holism, idealism, and so on and so forth. Well, first of all, I have to say that, of course, Greek philosophy is very important in Marco neo-Kantianism. There are a lot of publications, books, and so on and so forth on the topic, because Naples started philology, and so it was very important to Naples in there. Perhaps it's too epistemological from it is at least considered too epistemological nowadays, but he settled with one of Cohen's writing from 1879, I think, which was an academic publishing on the relationship between mathematics and reality. And so Cohen, in that passage from 1879, says that Mathematik ist die Vermittlung zwischen Denken und Sein. So, sorry, sometimes German accent comes, so to speak, obviously from my mind. But the very point is that all the neo-Kantians think that mathematics has this mediating power. And so the idea is that the task is, okay, you would like to shape as a scientific reality, you need mathematics. And this is very Platonic. If you think about line theory, and you are told by Plato that you have to read and interpret the line theory 2 steps at once. So you have the idea that mathematics is correlated to pistis. So the idea that you have mathematical concepts which are extracted from experience, but surprisingly, they work autonomously from that. I think that in the Republics, Plato says that sensation is a paracletic of thought, which is also mentioned by Cassirer several times. Experience is a paracletic of thought. So all the neo-Kantians in that sense are really Platonic. They understood themselves as the heirs of the idealist tradition, which can be traced back to Plato, in opposition to Aristotle, which is not true. Aristotle is not an empiricist, but or This is a very it's very peculiar basis, but in any case, they consider themselves as Platonists, so as idealists for that sense, because mathematics is the mediating factor between thought and experience. But I have to say that also the neo-Kantians, and especially Cassirer, when shifting to these ideas, so by way of example, the unity of nature, they reject an ontological, I don't know what to say, yeah. So the unity of the nature is not in a Parmenides sense something that you can say it's being. So the point is how to conceive of the reality. So one, that you have the unity of nature as expressing the Kraft der Seele, as Schiller has said. You have to think about the ontological status of the object onto which this Leistung, another word which is very important to understand what the neo-Kantians think about what mind and understanding do concerning reality. So it's a performance. I don't know how to translate Leistung. It's something that you do with your mind, with reality. And so you do not find reality, because you always find what you have made with your mind concerning reality. And so that's, I think, the main difference. And you also have to think that we are speaking of different kinds of mathematics. Cassirer is going towards a very analytic, so to speak, shift in the history of mathematics. You do not have, by way of example, geometry as conceived as, I don't know, the diagrammatic construction of reality, which is still Kant's concept in some sense. Kant's very complicated on this point, because in Critique of Pure Reason, he speaks of these universals in concreto, and he says that no matter whether you draw your triangle on paper or on your mind, then you have an established systems, which is Euclidean geometry and so on and so forth. So you don't understand up to which point you have, to which kind of construction he is mentioning. In fact, in the book on Einstein, Cassirer says that perhaps Kant's intuition is the most unfortunate word that Kant has used in his work. So you cannot understand that. And so what I would answer is basically that the unity of nature is a principle of the understanding. And it does not have, so to speak, an influence on the nature of reality. So reality as, I don't know, as it is. It's not something that you say, okay, Henkaitan is beauty. No, it's something that you just makes with your understanding. And so you have to save this difference. You cannot, so to speak, expose reality through laws.
Thank you very much. Non so chi ha fatto prima una mano, faccio lui.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Leinhoff, for a very interesting talk about Cassirer. In a way, I understand that also relates to the thinking you were discussing about mathematics. On one of the slides, I think we talked about it, but it did not really get the context to talk about possible empirical assumptions of Cassirer.
Yeah.
And you deny that there was such assumption, right? And now one question is, like you just also explained, in Cassirer you continuously get the idea there is some spontaneity, a finding something or what. On the other hand, some given, the sense data, or however you want to call it out, or if you're fan of concerning mathematics, that concept of mathematics cannot be the paradigm of the concept, because the concept has experience, the systems of being, as it said, right? So there is continuously this opposition. Concept is a function, it's applied to something. So continuously this opposition, right? So my question is now, how do you know that this is not an empirical assumption, that there is some
Okay.
If it is not, well, that will be the function of this function in Cassirer. Maybe you can say something more.
Yes. Perhaps it would be worth giving a look at this slide. So when I prepared, yeah, sorry for that. But the question, and also one of the items that I have written in the first version of this slide is a simple question. So were there in Cassirer observational statements? Can you say that? I think that Cassirer says yes, and I will explain you why, but he does not delve into the question. Because what he says is basically that you have here a fundamental formula of experience, A, B, C, D, and so on and so forth, as you can see, can be decomposed into smaller constituents. So it just resembles something that you will find on Russell, on Wittgenstein. It's very interesting. Then he calls those A, B, C, D whole of synthesis. And then he says, okay, with this whole of synthesis, what happens? You have this C function here, which are, he says, particular laws, but not empirical. That's my hypothesis, that this could be worded as empirical laws which reflect empirical statements and so observations. Because they say, what happens in holism? If you find an observation that says that is in contradiction with the whole of your theoretical thesis, what you do, basically you start modifying the lower level of your whole theoretical structure. And only at the end you will modify the core principles of your theory. Because of course, science works like that. You cannot drop a theory at, when facing your first difficulty, otherwise you will not go ahead. So I think that the question is that you find a place for that, and it's here, basically. But it's very complicated to have a concrete definition of what an observational statement, a protocol, so to speak, in the Vienna jargon to find. And also in determinism, by your example, you are told that physics does not begin with things. It begins with measurements. And so that's the first thing that you can say about science as symbolic form. You measure it. You don't know things in themselves. And so also the art of measurement is a sort of aesthetic contraction of physical reality. So there are statements concerning observational data, but it's very complicated to understand what they are. They are already reshape reality, and in any case, they are not protocols. So it's complicated to understand, because Cassirer doesn't give example. The only example that I have in mind is measurement statements, which of course are theory related, because you have, in order to measure, you must have equations. Otherwise, you do not make measurements.
Prego.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was kind of sentimental journey, because I edited it 20 years ago, some of the text you are working from. I would like to go on.
Thanks. I have translated them into Italian right now, so we hope that it could be.
I want to go back to the context of the Cassirer references to Schiller and Kant. You are talking about natural science focusing on mathematics and physics.
Yeah.
But if you,
of course,
but if you draw the context and you're speaking of biology as a natural science, you have in mind what is going on in neo-Kantianism. This is the shift from the priority of the personality to the self.
Yeah.
And the reason is, around 1900, you are in the middle of a vocabulary talking about nature in a non-mechanical sense.
Precisely. Precisely.
And then you have this, not Schiller's blind question. This is the, you agree, okay, this is the mechanical Darwinian view on nature, and then you need some constructing nature as something else more than mechanical.
Yes, I think that in that we can think about Cassirer also, of course, deals with biology, and we have also thought, we know that, by for example, modern programs in evolutionary theory, like one of Stephen Wall and others, have undergone a significant shift after the participation of Wall and colleagues to, I don't remember specifically where, to a conference in Germany, where they learn about this very long tradition about German morphology. And so the idea that you can have evolution as Entwicklung, in other words, that we have mentioned here days. And I think that Cassirer would answer it that way. basically, when I think in the fourth volume of Das Erkenntnisproblem, he also reconstructed the path of biology. And basically what he says against evolution is that you cannot have a pinnacle of evolution. Every living being, and so he, on that passage, he follows completely Schiller, Goethe, about the fact that I think that he says also in posthumous writings, perhaps in the Yale seminar on language, that you always have a jump. Doesn't matter whether the jump is from apes to humans. You also have a jump, I don't know, from cats to dogs. So every specific form has is individuality. And in constructing the whole system of these individualities, of course, there's something aesthetic acting, shaping out the system of the relationship between the different types of living beings are connected. And so if I am a paleontologist, by way of example, I try to reconstruct the whole history that brought from Australopithecus to the different species of Homo, there's something that makes reality as created by my principles and so on and so forth. It is also interesting that in those passages from the fourth volume of the Erkenntnisproblem, of course, he speaks a lot of Schiller, Goethe on the tradition in morphology. He also addresses Ernst Haeckel, another figure that we have mentioned, and that basically he also recovered some of Cuvier's idea of that there are kinds which are different from each other. Although, of course, Cassirer rejects the idea of fixes. So these forms are individuals, but they are not fixed. They continue, so to speak, evolving and so on and so forth. So you can distinguish them, but you also have this hint of teleological judgment. So it depends basically on the eye of the scientist that makes these distinctions. So I would say that.
Thank you very much. Your talk is really bringing into focus for me something that I find very confusing about the system.
Okay.
And it's the alternative to the common theory of knowledge.
Yeah.
Ends up sounding so by way of contrast, you know, when Colleen rejects, he doesn't call it the common theory of knowledge,
No.
but rejects that kind of very empiricist picture of what knowledge, what science is. The alternative that he presents is very robustly evident, right? So you get this clear picture of knowledge, that the object of knowledge is constituted by a priori concepts, laws, and principles that are somehow latent in mathematical naturalism. And then, by the time we get to Cassirer, even starting in substance and function, but then later, it seems like that idealism has been thinned out so much that when you present the views, it's like, well, it's just about it's a theory latentness holism. You know, it's almost indistinguishable just with doing, where, you know, there's no idealism at all.
Exactly.
So
the other way around, but yeah.
But maybe the simplest question, the simplest way for me to put this question is, where did the idealism? Is it still there? How important is it for Cassirer on your reading of Cassirer that there is this theory that is determining the object of knowledge? Or has it just sort of dissipated?
I think it's especially the reference to Duhem is also made because Duhem used for the first time the expression in symbolic form. So he says that basically physical theories put reality in a symbolic form, which is something that Cassirer mentions, and it's very interesting. I think one of the main points is about the fact that in that tradition, you find the encounter of very different concepts coming from different approaches. By way of example, you can study Narberth and see how Narberth changes neo-Kantian epistemology through the help of Poincaré's conventions, which are anti-Kantian. Poincaré just thought that you find synthetic a priori mathematics, but not in geometry. In geometry, you have conventions, so you have to adapt your theoretical systems to reality and observations through the guide experience. In fact, he says that Poincaré said that conventions are definitions in disease, which means basically that they are analytic principles, so to speak, in a masquerade, what to say. Well, I think that what happens in all these massive readings that neo-Kantians have, and they, so to speak, graphic capacity of putting things together, of course, you find, I think, contradictions in the final product. And these contradictions can also impact apparently fundamental tenets of their philosophy. So we know, by example, if we have to write a textbook on the history of philosophy, I think that we will put Marvel neo-Kantianism and in general neo-Kantianism on post-classical German philosophy, so idealism and so on and so forth. But of course, when you have a switch of this kind, you have many decades in which much happened with respect to the philosophy of science. I think that it's very complicated to recognize something like an idealist position at that point. Or think also about philosophy of mathematics. The first pages of Substance and Function, Cassius, in order to explain what function concepts do in mathematics, refers to Hobisch. So the idea that concepts in mathematics are concrete universals, and he traces back these concepts to Hegel's science of logic. And so the idea, the point is that when you translate, when you bring a concept from a certain paradigm and you basically you embedded it in a whole brand new paradigm, what happens is that you cannot recognize the original position. Perhaps what happens is that in this sort of Kuhnian, untranslatable transportation, you find a sort of vector in order to understand what we are saying. So I also had the idea that Cassius used by way of example. He takes arguments from the history of philosophy of German tradition in order to make his position understandable to his, by example, colleagues of philosophy. Of course, he has other philosophy and so on and so forth. That was his tradition, but then, I don't know, time goes by in some sense. So then time runs, and what happens is that you start from a very classic position, you go through an evolution in the history and the philosophy of science, and what you have at the end is that you have some words that, I don't know, a century before characterized heavily a philosophical and idealistic position, but after that you find the word but not the very same meaning, and you find a correlation which, however, is not, you can not, so to speak, square the one with another. It's not precisely the same thing. Even though I think that, by way of example, for at least for Cassius' first version of the philosophy of mathematics, it is. So I think it takes Hegel's concept of concrete universals, perhaps also more than Kant's ones. But this is what happens, I think. So you take a concept, you bring it into a new framework, and it's changed, even though you have the same word. So you can find that position, you can define that position idealistic. Perhaps it's something that Cassius feels important to understand himself as a, a figure in the philosophical landscape. But what you have is a different way of doing philosophy. Cassius' philosophy of science is different from Hegel's philosophy of science, which is a part of Hegel's system. Of course, you cannot do the same thing a century after. So that's my idea. I don't know whether I have answered your question.
80%.
Okay.
It was very helpful. Very helpful.
Okay. Thanks.
Ok. Allora, adesso ho il piacere di presentare Giuseppe Guastamacchia, ha completato i suoi studi presso l'Università di Torino, dove ha conseguito un dottorato di ricerca in storia del pensiero filosofico e scientifico e ha lavorato lì come ricercatore dal 2022 al 2024. È inoltre membro del gruppo di ricerca per lo studio del neokantismo dell'Università degli Studi Napoli Federico II e ha recentemente pubblicato la sua prima monografia dal titolo Il giovane Benedetto Croce, Erbartismo, Neokantismo e Scienze dello Spirito, con Bibliopolis, appunto Napoli 2024. La sua ricerca si concentra sull'erbartismo e sulle origini della psicologia scientifica. Lo ringrazio e gli do la parola.
So, thank you very much, Claudia, and good morning, everyone, dear colleagues. It's let me say it's a genuine pleasure and honor to take part in this international conference alongside some of the most authoritative experts in neo-Kantian studies here in Naples. My heartfelt gratitude goes to the organization and special thanks to Chiara Russo-Kraus. The title, can you hear me? Well, okay. So the title of my talk is Dilthey, Schiller and the Neo-Kantian Foundations of the Human Sciences. Today, I would like to suggest a research path that concerns the undeniable intellectual influence that Schiller had within Dilthey's foundational enterprise, culminating in his 1883 masterpiece, Die Einleitung in Geisteswissenschaften, and then in his psychological writings, which were published during the 90s, aimed at an ambitious attempt to elaborate an alternative psychology to the scientific naturalistic one, to serve as the foundations for the building of the human sciences. A few surface connections exist between Schiller's writings and Dilthey's project. The first quote is from the Letters on Aesthetic Education of Man. The contemplation of the beauty, the true, the perfect, is a true possession. In the moment we think them, we ourselves enter into the state we perceive. Affinities with Dilthey's Fichte resonate here. And the second one is contained in the lectures on philosophy and history. I'm quoting Schiller: the source of all history is tradition, and the organ of tradition is language. We know how important the Ausdruck theme will be in late Dilthey. But I don't want to stay at this level, at this stage. This isn't my aim. I want to examine something more fundamental, so to say. I would like to go more deeply, starting from the German intellectual context of the mid-19th century. I'll try to demonstrate how Schiller's great humanistic legacy may have shaped Dilthey's revolutionary conception of an analytic and descriptive psychology, conceived, as we know, both as the cornerstone for studying historical and social sciences and as an alternative to the emerging German scientific psychology during the 50s and the 60s. So how did Schiller's epistemology provide the crucial theoretical premise for Dilthey's methodological breakthrough in psychological science? To shed light on this point, a careful periodization will be essential. I will focus attention on 2 dates, 2 years that were highly significant, not only for Dilthey himself, but also for the broader context of German philosophy at the time: 1852 and 1865. And we will see what happened during the decade that made Schiller's echoes resonate even more powerfully. So, on Willem Dilthey, as you know, the literature is wide and of the highest caliber. I only mention one of the most recent volumes dedicated to the German philosopher and psychologist, Dilthey als Wissenschaftsphilosoph, in 2016, which stands as one of the most authoritative collection of essays on this giant of 19th century German philosophy. Well, let's begin with Dilthey's significant words contained in his 1883 work. Let's pay particular attention to these lines, not least because the Einleitung contains relatively few explicit bibliographical references. So in the Einleitung in die Geisteswissenschaften, Dilthey wrote, Schiller contrasts scientific analysis, which disaggregates and kills, with the synthesis of artistic contemplation as a procedure of an higher degree, so to speak, of metaphysical truth. And accordingly, in his aesthetics, he ascribed to the artist the grasping of nature's autonomous life. And then he concludes, Schiller highlighted how art paves the way for the scientific study of this world. He meant the human world. We should keep in mind these lines. This is a very interesting statement. Why, in what sense does art pave the way for the scientific study of the human world? If Dilthey articulates this position in 1883, does this suggest that Schiller's influence operated primarily through psychology, which in Dilthey's view, as we know, was the foundational discipline for the study of historical and social world? In my view, these are words not to be underestimated, and more generally constitute the statement that could allude, and this is the core of my talk, to the impact that the reading of Schiller may have had from an epistemological standpoint, I would say, on Dilthey's elaboration of an analytic and descriptive psychology, conceived as an alternative to the scientific, naturalistic, constructive, mathematical psychology deriving from the Arbutin tradition and from Fechner's psychophysics. My analysis will focus, as I said before, on 2 years. First one, 1852. The interest in Schiller is already evident in Dilthey's high school Abschiedsrede, and in the very first pages of his diary, in which there are clear debts to the German poet and philosopher regarding the relationship between ideal and life, and the task entrusted to poetry and philosophy to seek their composition in a higher unity. We can suggest that Dilthey had read in the early 50s, Grace and Dignity, the letters on the aesthetic education. Maybe Dilthey knew already very well the poem Die Künstler. He recognized the importance of this poetry in the mid-90s. The poem Die Künstler indicates the highest point of Schiller's entire youthful phase and contains all the foundations of his subsequent aesthetics. Art is the organ, once again, of humanization and prepares for truth and freedom. But let's dig a bit deeper. It's interesting to focus on 1852. First point is that we are just a few years before the Schiller Fest of November 8th, 10th, 1859. Fichte and Schiller's anniversaries were important events at the origins of neo-Kantianism. We are exactly 7 years before the Schiller Fest, which will be celebrated, among others, by Kuno Fischer and Friedrich Albert Lange. For Lange, Schiller's words are the mother's milk for the spirit of the nation. There's a fine introductory essay by Chiara Russo-Kraus, which explores the context of the Schiller Fest very well. So I will not go further on this point. Additional considerations demand analysis. In the mid-50s, as we know, Helmholtz delivered his historical speech, Über den See, as mentioned, which for many represent another foundational event of neo-Kantianism. We must admit on the origins of neo-Kantian movement, the scholarly debate remains very much open. For some of the most authoritative voices in literature on this topic, such as Professor Beisel, which is here, I'm very happy. The beginnings of neo-Kantianism should be significantly backdated to Herbart rather than Helmholtz, for instance. But this is, however, a deeply complex historiographical question, which it will be intellectually stimulating to engage maybe later. What else we can say about the philosophical context of 1852? We have a very important clue that dates 1852 and shed light on what was happening in the meanwhile German philosophical context. Herbart and Schopenhauer returned to prominence on German philosophical scene while Dilthey was reading for the first time Schiller. In 1852, Herbart published an article in the Zeitschrift für Philosophie und philosophische Kritik, in which he notes the growing interest in Herbart's work, as well as Schopenhauer's, in Germany during the 30s and the 50s, admitting not to be astonished by the attention dedicated to these two philosophers in the last few years. And I'm quoting Herbart, the main reason behind this phenomenon lies in the fact that many people felt dissatisfied by the direction taken by philosophy in Germany in recent decades, with this displeasure mainly being due to Hegelian philosophy. So, Herbart versus Schopenhauer. Herbart means critique of the faculties of the soul. Herbart versus Schopenhauer, which meant two very different receptions of Kantianism. Herbart means critique of the faculties of the soul, rejection of transcendental aesthetics, sharp critique of the Kantian a priori, and rejection of the idea of a spontaneity of the knowing subject, and implementation of an ambitious and strongly anti-Kantian attempt at mathematized psychology. It should not be forgotten that between the 40s and 60s, several books were published within the Herbartian school, attempting to formulate a third way between transcendental idealism and materialism. These are some of them. And on the other hand, we have Schopenhauer's legacy, who was criticized by Herbart himself in 1818 for the ample credit given to Kantian transcendental aesthetics. Schopenhauer was early considered a forerunner of psychophysiological neo-Kantianism. As Jürgen Bonnemeyer wrote in a brief article in 1872, there was a surprising agreement between Schopenhauer's essay Das Sehen und die Farben and the physiological conception of Kantianism developed almost 30 years later by Helmholtz. So here's the point. In 1852, we are in the midst of the post-Kantian debate on the possibility of a scientific psychology. The first established fact I would like to emphasize is that Dilthey approached Schiller, while in the background of German culture, a very precise alternative was taking shape, so to say. So for sure, Schiller's pages contribute to steering Dilthey away from the mathematizing and physicalizing attempts in Herbart's psychological program. When Dilthey began conceiving his analytic and descriptive psychology between 1852 and 1865, which will be the second date I would like to focus on, it's hard to believe he did not have in mind Schiller's promotion of the unified, organic, holistic, creative human being in opposition to the mechanized human being. But how the artistic method proved crucial in the psychological field. Let's just explore this research hypothesis by examining the specifics of Dilthey's antinaturalistic epistemology and how it can reflect Schiller's legacy. The second year I would like to focus on is 1865, the first essay in which Dilthey's reference to a real psychologie appears is from 1865. It was an essay on Novalis. 1865 is also the publishing year of Lange's Grundlegung der mathematischen Psychologie. In 1865, Dilthey's project for a psychology with phenomenological foundations was born. Dilthey drew from the Herbartian Theodor Weiss the distinction between analytic and explanatory psychology. And he is convinced that psychology that constitutes the key to access the historical and social world cannot be constructive. Hypothetical, scientific, naturalistic, it must be different. It must preserve in its methods and in its results, a la Schiller, the total and fully developed human being. And here's the second key point. I want to focus on a few passages from the idea in this regard. So what's the problem with mathematical and constructive psychology? Here's a few definitions. Now, in so far as explanatory psychology transfers to psychic life that procedure of scientific natural hypothetical construction, the problem arises whether the transposition is justified. What is explanatory? What is an explanatory science? By explanatory science must be conceived every subsumption of a field of phenomena under a causal nexus through a limited number of univocally determined elements. This concept designates the ideal of a science as it has been constituted, especially with the development of atomic physics. The greatest and most instructive example of how hypothesis transforms into a secret possession of science is given by the Copernican hypothesis, now no longer subject to any doubt. So these analogies with astronomy are very frequent among psychologists in those years. That's another very interesting topic, but I want to highlight that in Dilthey's view, explanatory psychology constructs an abstract totality based on hypothesis and has as its object not at all the entire human nature and the nexus of its contents. Then what is needed? It's something entirely different. So, as Dilthey wrote in the Ideen, mid-90s, while explanatory psychology employs fragments of vital fullness, mixing in presuppositions of naturalistic origin. At this point, the tribute to Schiller contained in the Enlightenment comes once again to mind. While explanatory psychology does this, descriptive psychology makes possible a universally valid connection of psychological knowledge in which the whole of psychic life is clearly and intuitively visible. The whole of psychic life is clearly and intuitively visible. It ends with hypothesis, while explanatory psychology, Herbert Fechner, begins with hypothesis. For example, the representations conceived as forces, which leads to the problem of three bodies, to the Eulerian theory of elastic collisions, which are important elements in Herbart's theory. So, well, we are arriving at the essential point of this issue. Dilthey's epistemology So Dilthey's epistemology of psychological science reflects in total the humanistic, we might say, organic spirit of Schiller's aesthetics. If on the one hand, analytic psychology reconstructs a whole from parts, but without fragmenting the vital flow, on the other hand, explanatory psychology employs shortcuts of vital fullness, fragments of vital fullness. I must proceed quickly, but I want to insist once again on the periodization I have suggested. In 1852, Dilthey reads Schiller's against the backdrop of Herbartian pressures in the psychological field and chooses another path, revolutionary psychology. In 1865, he elaborates for the first time the idea of an analytic and descriptive psychology, which would later be developed in these terms in the Ideen in 1895. What happened during this decade? And I'm going to conclude. The 3 volumes of Lotz's Microcosmos appeared. Those pages warned of the danger that the mechanization of the cosmos might undermine the human microcosm, which is more artful than others because it feels its own movements and admires those of the others. In those pages, Schiller was defined as the last guardian of mythology against the secularization of culture and the mechanization of the cosmos. Schiller's echoes were persistent in those years, especially for Dilthey, who then became Lotz's successor in Berlin in 1883. I want just conclude by emphasizing that there's a final clue that, in my view, should be considered as sort of confirmation of the relevance of Dilthey, so to say, artistic approach to the study of psychic structures. Dilthey died in 1911, and Wilhelm Windelband offered the final act of the famous debate on the foundations of the Geisteswissenschaften and the role of state and status of psychology within it. In his late response to Dilthey, Windelband seems to have grasped and highlighted the strong structural and epistemological nexus, we could say, between Dilthey and Schiller's legacy on the front of psychological methodology. In 1914, Windelband replied to Dilthey, "The psychology that the historian needs is something totally different from psychology as a science. It's the psychology of everyday life, the psychology of knowledge and understanding of man, the psychology of poets and great statesmen. This psychology that no one can learn or teach. Well, this psychology is an art, not a science." Thank you very much.
Grazie mille, ringrazio il sottosegretario Marco e do la parola al pubblico se ci sono domande. Sicuramente ce ne saranno.
No,
Only unsatisfying answers.
Allora, glielo passiamo. So come raggiungere. La faremo.
So thanks for your talk. And I was just curious about your opinion about perhaps the difference with Cohen's rejection of seeing phraseology. So in the hand of the book on the Kantianism method, Cohen basically says that there are, so he tries basically to counter-argument epistemologically. So he does not use the difference is that as far as I see, it just says, okay, there are different things. So descriptive psychology is different from this naturalized.
psychology, while Cohen makes comments about the fact that Fechner's Weber-Fechner's law as something troubling and puzzling in it, because you cannot distinguish in principle and empirically between perception and stimulus. There's for Cohen, everything that you can perceive of external reality is a sort of differential effect of the process that your mind creates about external reality. And so reality is a scientific part. So what do you think about that? So which would be, you know, the most interesting alternative? It would be better to just say, okay, we as philosophers would like to do a descriptive psychology, which is different from the psychology that you are going to make in your laboratories, or you will also...
You're asking for my opinion on this
Yeah,
great
start with
philosophical.
points.
I mean, so thank you, Luigi. And yeah, I'm not an expert on Cohen's work, but as we said yesterday, Cohen came from sort of, you know, psychologisch environment. I know it was in his youth phase very close to this kind of discussions and debates. I've noticed some affinities, a few affinities between Cohen's reply that you were explaining and the famous reply that Brentano made to Fechner in their Big Facts. And there's a strong distinction between the perception and what Fechner wanted or considered as psychical facts. The reply to Fechner is that Brentano's reply to Fechner is that Fechner isn't just measuring psychical fact, but only physical facts. I couldn't say more on Cohen's work and his connections with psychological theories. I'm sorry.
No,
I cannot
worry,
go
but I think
further.
that the Brentano's answer is perhaps...
It's very instructive. It's a very instructive reply, and it's illuminating on this great divide that at some point happened in German philosophical context and psychological culture. I mean, data is not so clear on the very features of his theory and his methodology. It will be until his death, rewriting and rethinking on this methodology and kind of different and revolutionary conception of psychology, which will be very important for Husserl in some way in a critical sense. But yeah, I really admire this kind of enterprise. And if you are asking me for an opinion on this great divide, I mean, it was a great revolutionary attempt, but not further explained and constructed by Dilthey, in my view.
Okay.
So thank you. Unsatisfying answers.
No, thank you not for your talk, but I must say I was surprised on this time in the context of neo-Kantianism. So my question is, what makes Dilthey a neo-Kantian? As we know, he was the editor of the academic edition of Kant. He edited his works with contributors, and his contributors were not from the Marburgian or Northwest technical context. There was discussion with Heimer that was edition without the commentary is not real edition, so I make a commentary separately. And the Korean was amused about this concept. Lindemann, of course, he was too unconcentrated, and therefore he had this edition of the LPT. And in the letters he complained, oh, what shit, I have to do this well, and this awful, and how can I say to this, that I'm not, I don't want to do this, and so on, this goes on for years and years. So what makes this type something? I think your was they have the same enemies. You said this.
Yeah, it's one of the 2 points I would emphasize. I mean, Dilthey's project is expressly and critique the historischen Vernunft. The enlightened Geisteswissenschaften was presented as a critic of historical reason, and this has a great Kantian legacy in it.
So it makes it a constant.
Why not?
Yeah.
And the second point I would like to emphasize that maybe is even more Kantian than Windelband and Ricker, insofar as he denies the constructive methods and the attempts at mathematize psychology. He accepts the great Kantian denial of mathematizing psychology. These are 2 of the main points I would emphasize to answer your question. But I mean, it's a complex issue. He is not canonized as a Kantian, as a neo-Kantian most of the time, but I mean, it's not right. I mean, there are a lot of features in his historical and philosophical project which testimonies is, I mean, strong affiliation to the Kantian movement.
I have some issues with your reconstruction of the debate about psychology. Yeah, first I'm not entirely convinced that there is such a strong opposition with this model everyone's side, the market side. But sorry, the other problem regards Dilthey and this idea that Schopenhauer that Schiller and different the direction of descriptive psychology, because as we also say, like in the previous days, of course, in Schiller there is also this strong emphasis on the psychological and even physiological element of the human beings. And even though Kant, as we all know, denied the possibility of mathematizing psychology because of this whole construction of the distinction between the phenomenal world and the nominal world, of course, admits the possibility of the causal and physiological description of the human behavior. And so, since this Kant Schiller tradition could also be ascribed to the scientific psychology, in the sense of the psychology that attempts the causal explanation, doesn't this problematize the idea that they would trigger in the direction of understanding psychology? And another point, because a possible answer would be that they are not opposed, because as in Kant and Schiller, you can have this sort of understanding of human beings, but also a different understanding. And I believe that indeed there is this, because I don't believe that they, as you say, reject the descriptive psychology. Of course, he wrote a lot of stuff about psychology, but in a lot of his writings, he's saying that we need these two. He doesn't deny the heuristic value of the causal explanation of the mind. It's just that there is a whole other way of understanding, comprehending the mind that must also be integrated, because the one is useless without the other. So I think that is not a rejection, but more like, so, and since you placed this, all these idea of the guns mentioned, this, maybe it's the guns and psychology, so not only the psychology that is about scientific psychology and street sense, but also a psychology that is capable of all of this deeper appropriation of human intelligence and this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I partly agree, but we should keep in mind that Dita conceives a psychology that takes into account the peculiar and qualitatively different way of giveness of psychic phenomena. And in his view, explanatory psychology isn't able to do this. So, I mean, yeah, it's not a full rejection of all your Bastian and scientific psychology, definitely not. But, I mean, I'm convinced that in Dilthey's view, explanatory psychology is not able to take into account the peculiar deepness of psychic events and psychic life. So it's an open issue. Thank you for your question.
Francesco?
So I have two questions to give the train of intense psychology. So the first one is I maybe sense a tension between like the idea of descriptive psychology as the psychology of great men of life personality. So like that accounting as somewhat noise in this way. And the descriptive psychology as the man of so psychology is a general subject and it's not within human itself, not sort of a specific psychological character like within psychology into this question. So how do you feel this tension balances the weakness characteristics of this technology? And also I'm interested in the contribution with Carol, the specific psychologists maybe largely characteristics was maybe one of the question about how is this psychology can get with the Muslims break down as a kind of counter form. What are the flexibility and likely
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understand your first question.
So this question is about tension between psychology of great men of historic types versus psychology of the men in general as a sort of general psychology. This will be the conditions to speak about the kinds of age and so on.
No, Dita doesn't conceive the descriptive psychology as a sort of second stage, second level analysis, which has its basis on the scientific one. If this is the answer. I mean, the late reply I emphasize its roots in the famous debate on the Kulturwissenschaft, and this is one of the finest critics that Windelband moved to Dilthey. Windelband was convinced that psychology should have a mathematical and scientific status. He was fully convinced of this, and this is the great divide with Dilthey's conception. As concerned the second question, yeah, Brentano is a sort of a lie for Dilthey. I mean, they at the same point they develop similar ways to explanation of psychological psychic life with the intentionality, which is the very different element which differentiates two conception. But I would say that, yeah, Dilthey and Brentano maybe could be considered as more Kantian in such I mean, in a way, more than Windelband and Rickert and the balance curve. because of this attention and this criticism move to mathematical psychology.
So maybe like you can start from the start, if you want to study about the title, develops this psychology from the critical psychology, it's a response direct. So it's not like that, or at least explain to the intentionality versus psychology.
But less anti-Kantian than Fechner or Drobisch.
I would say probably my opinion is probably more this exactly there I can again say so like
Lesser or more than Brentano, sorry, Fechner, Drobisch, and Herder. More.
So I don't know, one of the potential and they want to try to make this a counter class without this one's out and also and then also strong.
Okay. Okay. No. I don't agree on this part.
Altre domande? Ringraziamo ancora. C'è altre domande? Nessuna? Ok, allora ringraziamo Giuseppe Costano.